Tonight, we're going to wander into a part of the Middle Ages that's often painted with soft candle lights and whispered promises. But beneath the poetry and petals was a far grittier truth. This isn't the love story the ballads promised. No courtly glances or fairy tale endings here. Just the slow unraveling of two souls bound by duty, silence, and the weight of a time that never truly made space for love. They met at dusk, not in a field of flowers or a candle-lit hall, but in the courtyard behind a monastery, with mud caked thick around their boots and the smell of ox dung in the air. Her name was Eleanor, barely 15, hands red from scrubbing wool. His was Guy, a merchant's son with a bent back from counting coins too early in life. They didn't speak at first. There wasn't anything to say. The match had been made by fathers, signed beneath a wax seal days ago in a cold chamber with too many candles and too little wine. It was an arrangement, like most things were. The priest mumbled the words. A ring, too large for her fingers, slipped onto her hand. He kissed her cheek with lips that trembled more from obligation than affection. Then they were married. No feast, no dancing, just nods and quick prayers and the turning of backs. The house Guy had prepared for her was modest, a stone structure with a leaking thatch roof and windows that barely opened. The hearth smoked too much. The bed creaked even before they touched it. Eleanor's only possessions were a wooden comb, 2 aprons, and a brooch from her grandmother, long since dulled with age. At night, she lay still. He was gentle at first, awkward, then quieter with each passing evening. They tried to speak once. He asked about her family. She asked if he believed in saints. But the words fell between them like stones in water, sinking, forgotten, too heavy to lift. And still, life moved on. She woke before the sun, made bread, hauled water, watched as he mended shoes or counted sacks of barley by candlelight. There were no ballads, no roses, no letters slipped beneath doors. Romance, she realized, was for the dead queens in old poems, not for girls with bleeding palms and a husband who smelled of boiled onions. Sometimes she sang softly while she worked, old songs, things her mother used to hum. Guy would pause just for a second when he heard her, not smiling, just pausing. It was the closest they came to tenderness. Then winter came early, and the silence grew colder. But neither of them left, because in their world, leaving wasn't love lost, it was life lost. And so they stayed, bound not by passion, but by bread, weather, and the quiet terror of being alone.
The first snow came while Eleanor was still hanging linens to dry. It fell quietly, without warning, just a gentle dusting that crept over the rooftops and settled into the seams of her skin. She stared at it for a long while, hands numb, cloth frozen stiff in her grip. Inside the house, Guy was coughing again. The cold didn't ask for permission. Their home, already meager in warmth, seemed to shrink with every passing night. The hearth that once sputtered weakly now sulked into silence more often than not. Wood was short, and the merchant's work had grown thin. People didn't barter for goods when their fingers were too stiff to count coins. So the conversations, what little they were, turned practical. Did you check the stores? We're down to 2 onions and some oats. Will the chickens lay in this weather? Not likely. The warmth between them, if it ever existed, had faded like the last coals on the hearth. They weren't enemies, but they weren't partners either. They were just cohabitants in a life assigned rather than chosen. And still, Eleanor did her duties. She boiled cabbage until the smell soaked the walls. She mended Guy's socks with aching fingers. She poured broth into cracked wooden bowls and pretended not to notice when he didn't say, "Thank you." One morning, she found a robin trapped in the chimney. It flailed, wings wild with soot and desperation. Eleanor reached up, hands blackening, as she wrapped her fingers around the tiny, frantic thing. She opened the window and let it go. It didn't fly. It dropped, hit the ground, then lay still. When Guy came in, he found her scrubbing her hands raw, the scent of ash in her hair. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. It wasn't silence born of bitterness. It was something more ancient, something passed down through generations of women who knew better than to wish too loudly for things like joy or understanding. That night, Guy left her a piece of dried apple on the table. No words, no gesture, just the fruit, slightly withered, still sweet. She stared at it for a long time, and then ate it. It tasted like apology. Like maybe, deep beneath the routine and rot of their days, something small and human still tried to survive between them. Days blurred into weeks, and then one morning, Eleanor found herself vomiting into the snow behind the well. She knew before the healer said the words. She was with child. Her first instinct wasn't joy, it was fear. Not of Guy, not of the baby, but of what it meant to carry something tender in a world so sharp. She told him that night. Guy didn't speak, just turned toward the fire and stared. She thought for a moment that he was angry, that he'd tell her they couldn't afford it, that he'd leave. But he reached into his coat and pulled out something. A small bundle of cloth tied with twine. Inside it was a sprig of lavender, a memory of her dowry, a scent she hadn't smelled since her mother's funeral. He handed it to her. Still silent, but for once the silence didn't feel cold. It felt shared. In the weeks that followed, he started bringing home scraps. Not much, bits of cheese, wilted greens, a small wooden toy shaped like a lamb. He didn't mention the long walks, the bruises on his knuckles, the missing coin. She didn't ask. Because in this life, love wasn't spoken. It was given in kindling split before dawn, in bread divided before teeth touched it. In the way he stood behind her when she threw up, his hand on her back, not saying a word, not walking away. They were still strangers in many ways, bound by duty, not desire, but somehow, somewhere, beneath the layers of survival and dirt and too many unsaid things, they had begun to care. Not like the ballads, not like the stories whispered by girls who didn't yet bleed, but in the way you care for someone who knows how you cry without sound, who doesn't ask for your heart, but holds it anyway. By spring, Eleanor felt the child stir inside her. And when she looked across the table and saw Guy watching her, not like a husband, not like a man weighed by obligation, but like someone who finally saw her, she almost smiled. Almost. Because in the Middle Ages, love didn't bloom in gardens. It grew quietly in the frost, in cracked stone cottages, between two people who never got the chance to fall in love, but chose to rise into it anyway. The thaw came late that year. Snow clung to the village streets like a stubborn houseguest, refusing to leave even as buds pushed from the frozen earth in defiance. By then, Eleanor was heavy with child, her belly round beneath the patched layers of her apron. Every step was slower. Her breath caught in her throat each morning when she bent to stoke the fire. Guy had begun to talk more. Not much, just pieces. Things he'd never said before. that his father used to sing while hammering leather soles, that he dreamed once of buying a mule and riding south to the sea, that he thought her hands, even chapped and red, looked like they could shape stars from dough. She didn't know what to say to that, so she laughed, just once. It was a strange sound in their home, startling. Even the chickens outside paused, heads cocked. Guy looked up from the bowl he was carving and blinked, as if surprised by her laughter, then smiled, just a little. And for that one breath of time, the walls seemed to hold something warmer than just smoke. But the world outside their cottage didn't pause. Taxes came due. The Lord's steward rode through the village with parchment and steel. 2 goats were taken from the miller. The baker's youngest son was conscripted to dig latrine trenches for soldiers he'd never meet. Eleanor watched from the window. She knew better than to cry. She'd grown up hearing that tears were for nobles and brides, not for wives with bellies full of risk. One morning, she woke to find Guy gone. No note, no tracks in the frost. The fire was cold. Her breath clung to the air like fog as she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and waited. Hours passed. The sun moved like honey across the floor. She didn't eat, didn't move from the bench by the hearth. When the door creaked open near dusk and Guy stepped inside, soaked and red-knuckled with mud across his face, she didn't ask. He dropped a bundle on the table. Meat. Real meat. Rabbit, maybe. Skinned and clean. Beside it, 2 apples. Small but unspoiled. He didn't speak, just sat. She prepared the food in silence. They ate slowly, as if it would vanish. Afterward, she lit a stub of candle and asked softly, was it worth it? Guy looked at her. His eyes were tired, not from sleep, but from the weight of having done something he wouldn't name. He nodded. Yes. That night, she dreamed of their child, not with curls or eyes, but with warmth, a small breathing promise between them. The days turned mild. She washed linen in the stream and rubbed her aching back. Guy reinforced the roof with broken planks from the old chapel and patched the draft by the door with goat hide. They didn't talk much, but they touched more. A hand to the elbow, a shoulder resting lightly for a moment longer than needed. They weren't lovers in the way minstrels sang, but they were something else. Steady. Solid. A kind of love not meant to burn, but to smolder quietly through winters and famine. Eleanor went into labor before dawn on a quiet day, when the birds had only just begun to sing and fog still hugged the fields. The pain was slow at first, then fierce, then louder than the world. Guy fetched the midwife, Aude Leon, half-deaf and twice widowed. She muttered prayers under her breath, rubbed Eleanor's back, and whispered things that sounded like curses in the old tongue. The hours passed in sweat, screams, silence. And then, a cry. A girl.
Leon placed the infant in Eleanor's arms. She was purple with fury, red with life. Eleanor laughed again, twice this time. Guy, standing awkwardly nearby, stepped forward. He looked down at the child, then at her. No words, but his hand rested on Eleanor's shoulder. Firm, unshaking, like the earth after a storm. The fire behind them popped softly, smoke curling toward the ceiling like a blessing. They didn't name her that night. They didn't have to. Because in that moment, between 2 heartbeats, they weren't just 2 people bound by duty. They were a family.
The child did not have a cradle. There was no carved wood, no silken blanket lined with lace. Instead, she slept in a wicker basket, lined with moss, wool scraps, and Guy's old tunic, washed until the smell of sweat had faded into something gentler. Eleanor named her Milla, though she never said it aloud. It was a name she whispered while nursing in the middle of the night, when the world was asleep and the fire was down to its last glowing sigh. Milla. It meant nothing noble, no saints bore it, no noblewoman had carried it into legend, but to Eleanor, it sounded like safety. The village, predictably, didn't care. Births were common, survival wasn't. The midwife returned on the third day to examine the baby and declared her lungs loud enough to wake the virgin. That was the closest thing to a blessing Eleanor would receive. Guy had taken to carving again, small animals, a pig, a goose, a lop-sided cow with a cheerful grin. They lined the hearth like guardians, watching over the child's basket with silent, painted eyes. He said nothing when Eleanor tucked the cow beneath Milla's arm one evening. He only nodded once and went back to work. They'd been poor before. Now they were something worse, poor and tethered. Everything was measured in halves, half a loaf, half a sack of oats, half a night's sleep. Milla cried often. Her colic came like a storm, loud, irrational, relentless. Eleanor's breasts ached with milk that never seemed enough. Her back bent with each hour she rocked, shushed, hummed. And yet, she did it. Even in the moments when she wept from exhaustion, even when she looked at the tiny, squalling child and thought, "What have I done?" She still held her, still fed her, still placed her into the moss-lined basket as if she were a relic from heaven itself. Because that's what mothers did. They didn't wait for joy. They built it from suffering. Guy began sleeping on the floor when Milla's cries were too much. He never complained, just rolled up his cloak and lay by the fire, one hand resting near the poker like he might fend off the cold with sheer will. Once, Eleanor woke to find him standing over the basket, looking down at the child as though he didn't recognize her.
Not fearfully, just thoughtfully. He caught her watching and said, "She has your mouth," then went outside to chop wood. They said little in those days, but more than they had in the first year of marriage. Each word, when it came, felt like an ember, small, bright, fleeting, but warm enough to notice. On market days, Guy walked the 7 miles to town. He came back with strange things: a spoon carved from cherry wood, a sprig of rosemary tied in cloth, once a bit of chalk wrapped in sheepskin. Eleanor stared at it like a gift from the stars. He shrugged and muttered, the apothecary's girl was throwing it out. But when she traced Milla's name on the wall with it the next morning, he smiled without turning around. Still, it was not happiness they lived in. It was something closer to resilience, a sturdier thread. When the fever came in spring, 3 infants in the village died. Leone, the midwife, buried her own granddaughter with a cracked wooden cross and no ceremony. Eleanor stayed awake 3 nights straight, keeping damp cloths on Milla's brow, whispering to saints she didn't believe in. Guy didn't sleep either. He took her shift once, held the child, pale and slick with sweat, against his chest, and hummed a lullaby that had no melody. When the fever broke and Milla cried, a hoarse, living cry, Eleanor sank to the floor and laughed, tears in her mouth. Guy just leaned his head against the wall and exhaled. That night, they didn't touch, but they slept close,
close enough that their dreams could reach each other. In a world that gave nothing freely, not warmth, not food, not peace, this was how they survived. Not as man and wife, but as two people who had chosen to carry something breakable through the fire together. And somehow, it hadn't shattered.
By midsummer, the child had begun to laugh. It wasn't often, but when she did, usually at the sight of chickens squabbling or when Guy sneezed with a start, her whole body seemed to ripple with joy. Eleanor would freeze each time it happened, as if her breath might scare the laughter away. It was the only sound in the world that didn't echo with pain or hunger. The bread had changed. It was thinner now, salted more heavily to stretch the flavor. Flour was being hoarded by the Lord's reeve, and the village miller had been whipped in the square for under-measuring grain. Eleanor watched the flour sacks shrink week by week, and soon their daily loaf was barely the size of her palm. Still, they ate it. They had to. Hunger became a silent companion, not loud, not desperate, just always there. Guy took to fishing at dusk. The river was sluggish, and most of the fish were small and bony, but once he brought home a carp large enough to feed them both and leave a scrap for Milla. Eleanor baked it in the fire pit with wild onion and a few stolen herbs, and for that one meal they ate like people in a song. Afterward, she took his hand. No words, just fingers threading together in the flicker of the coals. That night, as Milla slept curled against her side, Eleanor whispered, "Why did you marry me?" Guy stirred, didn't look at her. "Because your father told me I'd have the shed and half a goat if I did." A beat of silence. Then, "Because you looked me in the eyes. Most girls don't." She wanted to say thank you, but it felt too small. So she closed her eyes and rested her forehead against his shoulder. Their peace didn't last long. It never did. By late summer, the sickness returned. But not the fever. This time, it was something worse. It began with a smell in the fields, then boils, then coughing that ended in blood. The Reeves boy was the first to die, then a shepherd's wife, then a girl Milla's age. The priest said it was punishment. The healer said it was rats. The baker said nothing, but started keeping vinegar-soaked rags at his door. Eleanor stopped going to market. She scrubbed the floors with lye and hung thyme at the windows. Milla was kept inside, even when she wailed for the sunlight. The doors stayed latched. The neighbors grew silent. One morning, Guy didn't return from the forest. She waited. The sun dropped lower. Still no sign. Eleanor placed Milla in the basket, wrapped her in wool, and stepped into the fading light. She walked the trail to the river, feet aching, breath shallow, and found him. Not dead, but sitting beneath the old willow tree. His hands were shaking. Next to him lay a body, wrapped in a wool cloak. A child. Someone else's. She didn't ask how he found it. Didn't ask why he brought it from the edge of the forest to lay it here. He looked up at her, eyes raw. "They burned a woman this morning," he said. "She'd cursed the well." Eleanor stared at the river. It wasn't her. No,
They stood there a long while. Milla whimpered in her basket. A breeze stirred the leaves above them like breath on a dying flame. "Let's go," she said softly. He rose, lifted the child's body in silence. They buried her in the clearing behind the brambles, where the foxglove grew wild. No prayers, just 3 stones. One for her, one for the others who'd follow, one for the weight neither of them could name. They walked home with their daughter between them. And that night, when Eleanor pressed her lips to Milla's brow, she didn't whisper a lullaby, she whispered a promise. Not of safety, not of happiness, but that she would fight tooth and nail for every breath the child took, even if it meant clawing at the world with bleeding hands. Because love, in the Middle Ages, wasn't a flower, it was a blade.
By autumn, the village began to smell of smoke more often than bread. Not the smoke of hearths or ovens, the other kind. The kind that clung to clothes and settled in your lungs. The kind that marked the spot where someone had disappeared. They burned 2 more women. No trial, no priestly intervention, just fear, pointed like a knife at anyone who lived too quietly, or spoke to animals, or carried herbs in her apron. Eleanor stopped visiting Leon entirely. The midwife's hut had been shuttered, her cat taken, her windows marked with a red X. "She's next," Guy said one night, staring into the fire. "They just haven't found an excuse." Eleanor didn't reply. She sat on the floor, Milla in her lap, humming tunelessly. The child was older now, thinner too. Her teeth had begun to come in, small, sharp things like tiny stones. She chewed everything. Bits of rush mat, her mother's sleeve, the corner of the wooden goose Guy carved. There wasn't enough food. There never was. The rats had returned to the grain bins, and with them, the illness. Eleanor heard whispers of an entire cottage being found empty, doors swung wide, floor scattered with bones and spilled oats. They said the family had died within hours. The reeve called it madness. The priest called it divine culling. The people called it what it was: hunger, wrapped in plague. The world was narrowing, and in its tightening grip, Eleanor and Guy grew sharper. Not cruel, just efficient. Their routines carved into ritual. Water before dawn, Milla's feeing second, firewood in thirds. Every moment mattered. One afternoon, as she gathered kindling near the edge of the woods, Eleanor found something odd. A pile of feathers. Fresh, still warm. No blood, no body. Just feathers, fanned out in a near-perfect circle, as if a bird had fallen, burst into down, and vanished. She backed away slowly, instinct prickling. And she was not alone. A man stood between 2 ash trees, cloaked in gray, face hidden, watching her. Not moving, not speaking, just watching. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She looked him in the eyes, just for a moment, and turned back toward the village. The next day she told Guy. He listened, then said nothing. The next evening he laid a knife beneath Milla's basket, just in case. They didn't speak of it again, but Eleanor began sleeping with the poker within reach, and the fire, once left to smolder by midnight, now burned through until dawn. There was no room left for softness. Not here. Not anymore. Still, sometimes when Milla laughed in her sleep,
Tiny chortles like bells beneath water, Eleanor allowed herself a single smile. Then it was gone. Like the birds. Like the safety. Like the world before the fires. The man appeared again, this time in daylight. Eleanor saw him first, standing at the boundary where their fields met the woods. The same great cloak, the same stillness. He didn't wave, didn't move, just stared, arms folded beneath the heavy fabric like some idle wraith. Guy was mending a fence post nearby. When Eleanor called out softly, just his name, he stood straight and turned to where she pointed. The man was already gone. That night, Guy stayed up long after Milla had been rocked to sleep. He sat outside the door with the knife across his knees. The hearth still glowed behind him, but he didn't turn once to the warmth, just sat there, breathing slow, like someone waiting for something to come. Eleanor didn't ask him to come in. She knew the answer. The village had started speaking in lower voices. News moved like sickness, quick, hushed, and too late to prevent. 3 more deaths. None burned, just vanished. A girl from the far edge of the pastures, an old man with no family, and a boy, no older than 5, who'd been sent to fetch milk and never returned. No one wanted to say the word, but they all thought it. Taken.
Some said it was the plague again, that it left no marks this time. Others blamed travelers, bandits, even wolves. But Eleanor knew better. It was the man in gray. He didn't feel like sickness. He felt like judgment. Days passed, then weeks. No more sightings. But the air had changed. Colder, even when the sun burned high. Drier, like something had wrung the moisture from the soil itself. Guy stopped carving. He kept his hands wrapped in cloth, said it was from the cold. But Eleanor saw the tremble. The night Milla spoke her first clear word, "Ma," pointing toward milk. Neither of them smiled. They just sat there, exhausted, waiting for the next thing to break. Then it happened. Leon was taken. No smoke this time. No crowd. Just a locked door, and a silence too complete to feel natural. Eleanor walked there herself, basket in hand, under the pretense of delivering broth. She found the house untouched. No signs of struggle. No tracks. Just an open window and a bundle of dried rosemary on the hearth. Untouched, but warm. As if someone had breathed on it. She turned and walked home, legs like stone. That evening, she said to Guy, "He's taking the ones who kept quiet, the ones who knew things." He didn't ask who he was, didn't argue, just whispered, "What does he want with us?" She looked at Milla, still too young to understand words, but watching, always watching. Eleanor said, "Maybe not us." She didn't sleep that night. Guy didn't either. In the silence, they both listened to the wind. But there was no wind. Only footsteps, soft and steady, somewhere beyond the window.
The morning after the footsteps, the world was brittle, sky like pewter, ground like glass. Eleanor woke to silence, not the soft hush of sleeping things, but that strange, suffocating silence that warned of something out of place. The hearth had gone cold. No smoke, no ember, no ash. Just stone, clean and empty, as though a fire had never been lit there at all. She sat up slowly, hand instinctively reaching for Milla. The child was there, curled like a cat at her side, breathing slow and even. But Guy was not in the bed. He wasn't in the house either. Outside, the kindling pile was gone. Not scattered, not burned, gone. She stood for a long moment, barefoot in the dirt, heart thudding like hooves behind her ribs. She called his name once, softly, then again, louder. No answer. But in the orchard, just beyond the old well, she found tracks. Boot prints. Not Guy's. And beside them, smaller ones. Not Milla's. They ended at the trees. The same trees where she'd seen the man in the gray cloak. That was where she found the stone.
Not just any stone, a smooth black one, shaped like a tear. It lay exactly in the center of the path, resting on top of a pile of wood. Her firewood, stacked neatly. Every log she'd been missing returned. She didn't touch it. Not the wood, not the stone. Just stared until the cold forced her back inside. Guy returned at dusk, empty-handed. His eyes were raw from smoke. "I went to the reeve," he said. "The blacksmith's son is gone. No trace, just a bowl of ash in his cradle." He looked past her, toward the hearth. "You lit the fire?" She shook her head. "It was gone this morning. Then the wood came back." Guy didn't speak for a long time. Then, "He's not killing them." A pause. "He's collecting." That night, they kept Milla between them. Didn't speak, didn't sleep. Just watched the fire and waited. The next morning, someone had etched a symbol onto their door. A spiral of thorns, drawn in something dark and still wet. The village had already begun to change. Doors stayed bolted, markets closed. A new kind of silence took root, one that didn't feel like waiting, but surrender. They were being tested, or maybe just marked. Guy packed their few things before midday. "We need to leave," he said. Eleanor didn't argue. She only packed the rosemary from above the hearth, and Milla's goose, and the knife. They didn't say goodbye to anyone. By nightfall, they were walking the old road north, past the hedgerows, past the last stone cross that marked the edge of the village. Behind them, the wind stirred. Not ahead, only behind. Something watching. Following. Not yet taking. Not yet.
They walked for 3 days before finding a roof. Not an inn, not a village, just an abandoned chapel clinging to the edge of a hill, its roof caved inward like a broken mouth, its bell long since swallowed by ivy. But it had walls, and a door, and silence, and that for now was enough. Milla cried the first night, her tiny voice echoing too loudly in the hollow space where saints had once been carved into stone. Guy held her close, whispering stories that no longer had endings. Eleanor built a fire from the remains of a broken pew, the flames sending shadows dancing across the faded murals above. Figures with halos, faces scrubbed away by time.
She didn't pray. Not anymore. They weren't alone for long. The second day, they heard voices outside. 2 women, 1 man. Travelers like them, moving without names or directions. One of the women wore a necklace of bones, rat skulls, polished and strung tight around her neck like pearls. The man had a tooth missing and eyes that didn't blink enough. "We saw the sign," he said. Guy looked at Eleanor. "We don't carry signs," he replied. The woman with the bones grinned. "Not the ones you make." She pointed to the door. The spiral of thorns had followed them, etched in the same place, the same size. Eleanor touched it with one trembling hand, dry now, but fresh.
"You've been marked," the second woman said. "Just like us." She lifted her sleeve to show a scar. Circular. Ragged. Guy stepped between them. "What does it mean?" The woman shrugged. "Maybe nothing," she said. "Maybe everything." They stayed together that night. 5 souls in a place meant for worship, sharing bread that tasted of dust and secrets. One of the women told stories of others, of scattered groups on the roads heading north, always north, as if the wind itself was pushing them from behind. As if something was hurting them. There's talk of a place, a safe one, past the drowned fields, past the black stones. Eleanor asked no questions. But she remembered the black stone she'd found in the woods, the one shaped like a tear. They left the chapel at dawn, all of them, together. And as they walked, Eleanor glanced back only once, just long enough to see the chapel door swing open behind them. There was no wind, no hands, but it opened anyway, welcoming something in, or letting it out.
The road that led north was barely a road anymore. Overgrown, broken by roots and old stones, it wound like a lazy scar through the forest. At times, it disappeared entirely, swallowed by moss or diverted by trees that had grown where no trees should have been. But the group pressed on. 7 now. Eleanor, Guy, and Milla. The bone necklace woman, whose name was Thera. The quiet woman with the scar, Ysault. And the blinking man who never gave his name. They didn't speak much, only when needed. The woods demanded silence. There was something about them, something heavy. Not the weight of branches or brambles, but of listening, as if the trees themselves leaned in, catching every breath. On the 4th night, they came upon a clearing, a circle of stones, blackened by fire, though no ash remained, just the scent, bitter and faint, like charred teeth. In the center, a doll, woven from rushes and hair. Milla reached for it, but Eleanor pulled her back. "It's watching," said Thera, voice low. Ysault nodded. "They leave these where someone's been taken, or is about to be." "Who's they?" asked Guy. No one answered. They moved on before night fully fell. They didn't make a fire.
They never did now, not unless absolutely necessary. Instead, they curled beneath cloaks, their bodies pressed close for warmth, ears tuned not to the wind or the owls, but for the sounds that didn't belong. Hoofbeats with no horse, voices with no mouths, breathing shallow and wet,
just beyond the edge of light. It was Yseult who noticed it first. A second path, beneath the one they walked. "It's older," she said, kneeling. She brushed away moss, revealing stones beneath dirt, perfectly round, placed in a line. Thera frowned. "Burial path?" "No," Yseult said. "Pilgrimage." They followed it without deciding to do so, the way one might follow a scent or a memory. And slowly, the woods began to change. The trees thinned. The air grew colder. And then they saw it. A field, flat, endless, and drowned in shallow water. No birds, no insects, just the distant shape of something. Something vast and sunken, half lost beneath the flood. "A village?" Guy whispered. "No roofs," said Thera. "Just chimneys. See them?" He did. Jagged black spires rising from the water like broken teeth. "They say there are houses still whole down there. Floors with bowls still full. Beds with no dust." "People?" Alinor asked. "Not anymore." They crossed the field by dusk, feet wet, shoes ruined, Milla silent in her mother's arms. She hadn't cried in days. Didn't smile. Didn't blink much either. Just watched the horizon, like something out there was waiting for her. That night, the spiral appeared again. Not carved into wood, not drawn on stone. This time, it bloomed on Milla's skin, a faint red mark just above her heart. By morning, the mark on Milla's chest had darkened. What had been a whisper of red now pulsed softly, faintly, as if listening for something far away. It throbbed not with pain, but with rhythm, a beat that was not her own. None of them spoke of it. Instead, they moved slower, more carefully, not out of caution, out of fatigue, the kind that lives in bone and memory. Every footstep through the wet field felt like walking through syrup. The water was too still, too quiet. When it moved, it did so without wind. They walked until the water reached their thighs. And then the land changed again. It wasn't visible. There was no shore, no break in the horizon. But the shift was unmistakable. The water dropped suddenly to the ankles, and beneath it, the stones returned, smooth, round, placed with intent. The pilgrimage path again. "The drowned way," Yseult whispered. No one asked how she knew. In the distance rose a steeple. It jutted from the flooded plain like a finger pointing upward in accusation. Its spire was rusted, twisted, crowned not with a cross, but with a wheel of iron. Its spokes bent in a spiral. Beneath it, the shape of the chapel could just be made out, submerged, its arched windows staring blankly beneath the surface. "The Chapel of Vows," said Thera. Guy looked at her. "You've been here." She shook her head. "Not me, but my grandmother spoke of it. Said it was where the old promises were sealed, the ones you couldn't break, even with death." Alinor clutched Milla tighter. "She's getting colder. Even with my cloak, she's shivering." Yseult stepped forward, kneeling in the water beside them. She touched Milla's forehead. Not to check for fever, just to touch. Her lips moved, but no sound came. A prayer, maybe, or something older. The blinking man cleared his throat. "There's a dry place ahead, just beyond the church." "How do you know that?" asked Guy. But the man didn't answer, just kept walking. The chapel loomed larger as they approached. Its roof was gone, the stone eaten by water and time, but the spiral iron remained untouched. It gleamed, even in the dim light, as if polished from within. They passed it in silence. No one looked inside. Even Milla turned her head. Then, true to the man's word, the water receded. The ground rose gently, revealing a ridge of black stone and withered grass. A ring of trees surrounded it, not forest, but orchard. Dead now, long rotted, their bark peeled in long ribbons, and no birds nested in their branches. In the center of the grove stood a stone table, long, flat, carved at the edges with words in a language none of them knew, save one. Yseult ran her hand along the letters and breathed in sharply. "It's a record," she said. "Of what?" Thera asked. "Of names, of people who made the vow." "Vow to what?" "To love," she said, voice thin. It hung in the air like frost. And then Milla spoke. Her first words in days. "He's waiting." Everyone turned to her. Her eyes were closed, but she was smiling. "Who?" Alinor asked, voice tight. Milla opened her eyes and pointed behind them at the chapel. A figure stood beneath the iron wheel now, not tall, not cloaked, just there. A man in plain robes soaked to the knees, his hands folded, his head bowed, hair the color of bone. No face could be seen beneath the shadows, but he was watching. "I dreamed him," said Milla. Thera stepped in front of her, hand on the dagger at her hip. It looked small in the open. Yseult did not move, because she had seen the figure before. Not here, not in dreams, in a drawing, carved into the wall of a ruined hall years ago, deep in the mountains. A carving she had touched and wept over, without knowing why. "The bridegroom," she whispered. The figure stepped forward slow, but not toward them, toward the stone table. And then he was gone, like water sinking into sand. Milla collapsed in Alinor's arms. The spiral on her chest dimmed, not vanished, just resting. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was waiting, like the vow itself.
They did not speak as they lifted Milla. The silence now was not fear, but ritual, the kind of hush kept at funerals, or in churches where names had been forgotten, but grief had not. Alinor carried her slowly, pressed close, as if her daughter might be made warm again by nearness alone. They left the chapel behind. The orchard grew denser the further they went. Trees twisted into arches, roots curling up from the earth like frozen serpents. Their bark shimmered with frost, though no snow had fallen. Some trunks bore carvings, initials crossed through with spirals, hearts cracked in two, and once a face, not drawn in love, but grief. The eyes had been gouged out. They called this place the Orchard of Oaths, Thera said. She ran her hand along one tree's trunk, leaving a smudge where frost met skin. Lovers came here to promise what they couldn't keep. "Why?" asked Guy. His voice felt loud here. "Because the orchard remembers," said Yseult, "even when the lovers forget." The blinking man chuckled under his breath, a hollow sound. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he said. "The vow outlives the love." They came to a clearing, perfectly circular, ringed by trees that leaned inward, as if bowing. In the center stood a stone archway, freestanding, no walls, no doors, just the arch, made of bone-pale stone, veined with silver.
Beneath it, the ground was different. Not mud, not grass, but tiles, hexagonal and black, slick with mist. A path, one that led nowhere. "There used to be a hall here," Isolde said. Her voice was distant. "A longhouse for the joined, a place to bind hearts and hands." "Gone now," Eleanor whispered. "Not gone," Thera corrected. "Withdrawn." Milla stirred, not awake, but breathing deeper, and the spiral pulsed once more. Isolde stepped forward and knelt before the arch. Her fingers found a groove in the stone, a line of script worn smooth with weather and time, but the shape of the letters still lingered. "Do you remember?" she asked aloud. The orchard did not answer, but something passed through it. A wind that did not move the leaves, a breath without a body. They stood in it together, letting the cold settle into their lungs. Then Guy stepped back. "I don't like this. This vow, it's not about love anymore. It's about debt." "No," said the blinking man. "It always was." Eleanor sank to her knees, Milla limp against her shoulder. She didn't choose this. She didn't ask for it. "But she bears it. So did the rest of us," Thera said. The air grew heavier. From somewhere deep in the orchard, a low sound echoed. Not a cry, not a word. A hum, a harmony made of breath and shadow, a song that knew their names. The arch shimmered, not with light, with memory. They saw flashes, a couple standing beneath it, hands joined with cords of silver, a kiss given in desperation, not joy, a storm swallowing the hall, a grave dug with bare hands. And then, just once, the bridegroom again, only this time not at the chapel. Here, standing just beyond the arch, hands held out, empty, waiting. Isolde turned to the others. "This place doesn't want a sacrifice." "Then what does it want?" asked Guy. "A witness," she said. "Someone to remember." Thera stepped forward. So did the blinking man. And Eleanor, after a moment, rose, her arms still full of Milla, her back straight. "She's not giving herself, but she'll see it." They passed under the arch. The orchard exhaled, and the vow began to speak.
The moment they passed beneath the arch, the orchard changed. Not in sight. The trees still leaned, the frost still clung to every curling root, but in feeling. The very weight of the place shifted, as if time had bent inward, drawn tight around them, a hushed cocoon made not of silence, but of echoes. They stood now in a place between. No birds, no wind, just the soft hiss of mist curling along the black tiles at their feet, and the low hum of that song that had no melody, only rhythm, a slow, looping cadence that pulsed in their ribs and knuckles and hearts. Milla opened her eyes, not wide, just enough to let the frostlight catch her gaze. She looked up at Eleanor and whispered a single word. "Down." The tiles answered, a soft grinding like teeth behind stone. A seam opened in the ground, a spiral, of course, curling inward toward a hole barely wider than a man's shoulders. Steps descended, shallow and slick. No one spoke, not to argue, not to protest. They followed her gaze and began to descend, the blinking man first. Then Thera, her necklace of bones silent for once. Then Guy, shoulders stiff, fists clenched. Then Isolde, lips moving with silent names. And at last, Eleanor, holding Milla like a bridal offering, though no joy hung in her arms. The stairwell was lit not by torchlight,
but by something faint and root-colored. The walls were lined with carvings, not scenes, but faces. Dozens, hundreds, all cast in profile. Each one different, some smiling, some weeping, some with no mouths at all. And above every face, a name. They recognized none, yet some felt familiar. At the bottom, a chamber, perfectly round, domed like a womb. The air was thick, not with rot or damp, but with warmth. Not comfort, but the warmth of something living. The walls pulsed, faintly, as if breathing. And in the center, a chair. Not carved, not crafted, grown from root and soil and bone. Milla reached toward it. Her hand trembled. But Alinor did not stop her. She placed her daughter gently in the chair, as if laying her into the past. The humming grew louder. The roots responded. They curled around Milla's wrists and ankles, not to bind, but to hold. Gently, the way a mother might cradle a child who's just begun to remember their name. "She's not dying," Yseult said. "No," said the blinking man. "She's returning." "To what?" Guy asked. But no one could answer, because the spiral was moving now, not on the floor, but in the air. A slow shimmer, visible only when they stopped breathing. A pattern of movement and light unfolding like ink in water. It wrapped around Milla. She smiled. Not wide, not joyous, but true. And then she began to speak, not in a voice they knew, but in one older than language. The chamber listened. The roots trembled, and slowly the walls changed. The faces shifted. New ones grew from the stone. Thera gasped, because one of them looked like her, another like Guy. Even the blinking man stepped back as his own gaze stared back at him from the wall. These were not carvings. They were memories. Preserved. Offered. "Everyone who loved and was left behind," Yseult whispered. Alinor stared at the wall. And there, just forming, was her. Her arms still curled, holding the echo of a child no longer in them. She didn't cry, not because she didn't grieve, but because the vow had finished speaking. And now it waited.
Milla was asleep now, or something close to it. She sat unmoving in the root cradle, her head tilted gently toward her shoulder, lips parted slightly, the faintest breath fogging the air. Not cold breath, but warm, like steam rising from bread fresh out of an oven. Her chest rose and fell, but the rhythm belonged to something older than her lungs. They stood around her, the five of them, in a stillness too full to be silence. Each waited for something, a sign, a word, a reason. But nothing came. Only that hum, low and curling at the edges of their ears, like a forgotten lullaby made entirely of the moments when love cracked, and what remained was the echo of what it used to be. Guy looked up at his own face in the wall. "You think this means we're part of it now," he said, half to himself. "That we've been claimed." Thera didn't answer. She sat cross-legged on the floor, bones in her lap, head tilted like a listening dog. Her fingers traced invisible lines in the air, a gesture, a spell, a memory. The vow doesn't claim, it remembers. That's worse. The blinking man chuckled again, dry and paper-thin. Yseult stood before her own likeness, eyes half-carved, lips pursed in thought. Her stone self looked older,
wiser, sadder. "Do you know what it was, this vow?" she asked. "Love," Eleanor said. But Ysolde shook her head. "No, not love, not truly. Loyalty. That's what this was built on. Love can fade, but loyalty twists." The blinking man finally spoke, not in riddles, not in metaphor. "Two lovers built this place long before memory. One died, the other refused to forget." Guy raised an eyebrow. "So what, this is some old temple to heartbreak?" "No," the man said. "It's a prison, built from remembrance, fed by repetition." Thera's hand stopped moving. She looked toward Milla. "She's the key, then, or the door." Ysolde frowned. "Why her?" "Because she was born after, born without the burden, without the spiral in her blood. It mocked her not to take her, but to enter her, a vessel." Eleanor stepped between them. "No one is taking her." "She's already been taken," Thera said gently, "but not in cruelty, in invitation." The chamber darkened, not from light, but from memory. A thickening of the air, the faces on the walls blurred, stretched, blinked. They began to sing, not with voices, but with expression. Each stone mouth shaped words from a language without sound. Milla stirred. Her eyes opened, not blue now, but silver. She looked at her mother, and for a moment she was still Milla. "Do you remember, Mama? Do you remember the way we walked?" Eleanor fell to her knees. Tears did not fall, only breath. Only a slow release of something she hadn't let go since her husband died, since the famine started, since the forest whispered of roads that went nowhere but down. "I remember." And with that word, the spiral stopped turning. The chamber exhaled and began to fade. The walls softened. The tiles turned to dust. The arch above collapsed inward without sound, crumbling into root and ash. And the five of them were standing in the orchard again. The trees had changed, not in shape, in presence. They were no longer leaning. They stood tall. No frost clung to them now. Above the circle of stone, the sky had cleared, and Milla was gone. No root, no cradle, no chair. Just the impression of a child pressed into the earth as if she had been drawn there by memory itself. Eleanor didn't scream, didn't cry. She only reached down and laid her hand over the print in the soil. Ysolde took her other hand. Thera knelt beside them. Guy stared at the trees and whispered something no one heard. And the blinking man laughed, not cruelly, not joyfully, just knowingly. It remembered her. And the spiral, now burned faintly into the earth, pulsed once, then stilled. The vow was at rest, but the orchard would remain, waiting for the next song, the next promise, the next love too deep to forget.
By dawn, the trees had grown taller. Not as if they'd stretched overnight, but as if they had shed a disguise. No longer crooked, no longer frostbitten. Their bark bore symbols now. Faint spirals traced in rising patterns, like a language not meant to be spoken aloud. The five remained in the clearing. No one suggested leaving. There was a sense, not quite command, but presence, that the place wasn't finished with them. That some last act still waited, coiled,
like a vine underfoot. Isolde was the first to move. She walked to the hollow where Milla had vanished and knelt, placing her palm flat to the soil. The earth felt warm. Not with sunlight, but with memory. Pulsing, slow, almost like a second heartbeat. "She's not gone," Isolde said, not looking at them. "Not gone like before." Alinor stood behind her, one hand on the small of her back. She was the only one without the vow. Farah corrected her. She was the only one who didn't fear it. The blinking man walked the edge of the grove, his fingers brushing the bark, reading it like a book. We weren't chosen. We were left behind, and the left behind always find their way here. Guy sat beneath one of the trees. He had started carving something into a small square of wood, a habit he hadn't shown before. His hands moved with surprising grace. He carved a spiral, then crossed it out, then began again. What do we do now? Go back to the village? Tell them a child vanished into the dirt and the trees got taller? "There's no village anymore," Farah said. "Not the one we left." They were quiet after that, not just from fatigue or grief, but from the strange calm that followed the breaking of something ancient. The kind of stillness you feel after a scream, not because it's safe, but because the air has been emptied of anything else. At midday, they heard the bell. A faint sound, distant but clear, a single toll, followed by silence. Guy looked up. "Church bell?" Isolde shook her head. "No church around here." Another toll. Closer now. Alinor turned toward the woods. "It's calling." Farah's necklace clinked gently as she stood. Or warning. Still, they followed. The path that opened wasn't one they remembered, though they'd passed this way before. It looked carved, not by hand, but by movement. Roots parted, stones realigned. The world rearranged itself as they walked. Not threatening, not cruel, just watching. The forest darkened, not from clouds, but from memory, as if each step brought them deeper into the folds of a forgotten story. And then, a gate. Iron, rusted, twisted like antlers, hung on no wall, just standing, freestanding, in a circle of bare ground. Beyond it, nothing. No trees, no sky, no horizon. Just a great, gray stillness, like the air before snowfall, stretched to eternity. The bell tolled again. The gate opened. No hand touched it. No wind moved it. It simply understood. And behind them, the woods began to close. Not fast, not loud, just certain.
The gate did not creak. It did not moan or sigh like iron should. It simply widened, the way a mouth might when it has waited long enough. The space beyond it wasn't quite shadow,
But neither was it light. It held no color, no air, no cold or warmth, just a soft absence, like the space behind closed eyes. Eleanor stepped forward first, not boldly, not with certainty, but with the quiet, resigned courage of someone who had already lost everything and was willing to lose a little more if it meant understanding why. The others followed, one by one. Isolde, who had not slept in days. Guy, who still carried the carving in his palm. Thera, bones clicking softly in rhythm with her steps. The blinking man, last, who paused at the threshold, turned, and whispered to the trees, "We remember," before stepping through. And then the gate closed. Behind them, no trace of the forest remained, only the soft, pale plain, endless and flat. No echo to their footsteps, no horizon. Just the impression of walking, and the knowing that something watched. They walked for what felt like hours, maybe more. Time folded strangely here. It didn't pass so much as it pressed, as though it weighed them down the longer they stayed, memories stretching thin and soft like old parchment soaked in oil. Then came the shapes, not structures, not quite, but forms, half-formed doors, a window hung in nothing, the frame of a bed with no legs, suspended in the stillness. Each object seemed plucked from memory, not theirs necessarily, but someone's. A child's doll, eyeless and bloated, a sickle rusted in mid-air, a rope tied in a sailor's knot, swaying gently though there was no wind. Isolde reached out to touch one, a cloak hook mounted to invisible stone, but it dissolved under her fingers. Not meant to hold, only to remember. At last they came upon a circle, a perfect ring of standing stones, each etched with spirals, some elegant, some erratic, as if carved in panic. And in the center, a pool, still, black. Not water, not glass, but something in between. Eleanor stepped to its edge and looked down. She gasped, not in fear, but in awe. Beneath the surface, 1,000 versions of herself stared back, some young, some old, some smiling, many not. Each held a different memory in their eyes. A wedding, a stillborn child, a song half remembered, a knife left clean beside an untouched loaf. They were not lies, not illusions. They were all true, or had been somewhere. Thera looked too. Her pool shimmered gold for a moment, then red. Guy saw his own hands around his own throat, then a woman's, then his mother's, then none at all. Isolde didn't look. The blinking man wept quietly and said, "There were so many chances." A voice rose then, not from the pool, not from the sky, from within, from the marrow. You are not here to fix it, only to carry it. Eleanor knelt. She understood now. The vow was not about love fulfilled. It was about love unfulfilled. Love cut short, stretched thin, burned black, buried too deep, and still remembered. The pool shimmered, the stones hummed, and Milla's voice, unmistakable, spoke behind them. "Do you remember the way we walked?" They turned, but no one was there. Only a path leading out of the circle, back toward the gate. No longer blank, no longer featureless. It looked like the road they had taken north. Overgrown, crooked, worn, and familiar. Without speaking, they began to walk. Not away from the vow, but with it. Not to forget, but to carry. Because the vow was not a curse. It was a memory that refused to be lost. And in that memory, love endured, even if the bodies did not.
They walked for what felt like days, though the sky did not change and the air held no passage of time. Each step pressed down into silence, the kind that coats the inside of your bones. There were no birds, no wind, not even the sound of breathing, though each of them still moved, still lived. The path twisted, not like a road, but like a memory, circling back on itself, then veering, then stopping short before continuing as though it had forgotten where it was going. None of them spoke. Until Farah fell. Not a stumble, a collapse. Her knees gave way on the moss-soft ground, and her necklace of bones clattered with a hollow finality. Alinor and Guy dropped beside her, but she did not blink, did not move. Only her lips parted. "I remember now," she whispered. Yseult knelt beside her, cradling Thera's skull-heavy head. "What do you remember?" But Thera only smiled. "My vow was never to a man." The others stilled. "I loved her," Thera said softly, "the miller's daughter, with red hands and a voice like frost. I watched her wed the baker. I watched her die giving birth to a child that wasn't mine." The air did not stir, but something in the path shifted as if acknowledging her truth. I carved the first spiral on her doorstep. I did not know why. And then Thera was still, not dead, not gone, just still. The others rose. The necklace was no longer bones, but seeds, pale, papery, waiting to be planted. They moved on. The path narrowed, then widened, then became two. Guy stopped at the fork, eyes uncertain. He said, "We split up." Yseult shook her head. "That's not what we do anymore." But the blinking man, who had not spoken since the circle, stepped forward. "It's not."
Still, the road unfolded. Their feet bled now, though none of them remembered when the bleeding started. The soil drank the blood without stain, without sound. Then, a house. Not ruined, not rotting, just old, timeless. A cottage nestled between two weeping trees whose bark shimmered faintly like old honey. Smoke curled from the chimney, not thick, not heavy, but sweet-smelling, like elderflower and warm milk. They approached slowly. Inside, the room was full of light and empty, but not abandoned. A table set for 4. A fire that did not burn. A cradle
with no child, rocking gently though no wind touched it. Eleanor stepped forward. "This is where it ends," she said. Guy furrowed his brow. "No, this is where it began." The cradle creaked. The spiral, carved into the wooden rim, glowed faintly, and above it, painted on the wall in hand-drawn ochre, were the words, "Those who vow must wake." Isolde reached out and touched the wall, and the room unfolded. Not exploded, not dissolved, but unfolded, like parchment revealing more ink. They were no longer in a cottage, they were in a hall. Stone, lit by candlelight that flickered like breath. And in the center, not a throne, not a shrine, but a bed, a sick bed, draped in old cloth, and upon it, Milla, eyes closed, chest still. Eleanor ran to her. She didn't cry, didn't scream, only placed her hand over the spiral on Milla's chest. "Milla, the vow is done. You may wake." But Milla did not stir. And then Isolde, soft, slow. She never made the vow. She was the song. The silence held its breath. Then the spiral on Milla's chest, the one drawn in red, peeled upward like a leaf in spring. Not bleeding, not breaking, becoming. Milla opened her eyes, and all the candles went out. They stood in darkness, no longer afraid, because some darkness is not a void, but a home, a memory, a vow fulfilled. And in the dark, someone began to hum. It was the old song, not romantic, not tragic, just true.
The hum became a lullaby, not a melody with words, but a shape in the throat, deep, low, and steady, the kind of sound that mothers once sang to babies before there were names for things like cradle or womb. It filled the chamber like fog, soft and dense, wrapping them all in its rhythm. Milla was standing now, not rising, standing, as though she had always been upright and the bed had simply forgotten. Her eyes were wide but calm, a soft gray like river stone. She did not look at any of them, only past them, as if someone else was there, or something. Eleanor reached for her hand. It was warm. "Milla!" Her voice broke, not from grief or fear, but relief too deep for weeping. Milla turned her head slowly. "There's more," she said. And they understood. The vow was never about one path. It was a thread that tied all things, not just people, but moments, places, hungers, silences. And that thread didn't end in death. It ended in remembrance. The chamber began to change again. The walls did not shift, the space did. Stone softened to earth. The light returned, not candlelight, but the pale golden glow of early spring, the kind that filters through trees before their leaves fully open. They stood now in a garden, wild and strange, vines with fruit that pulsed faintly as if breathing, flowers shaped like open mouths, trees whose bark bore faces,
not in terror, but in longing, like they had once spoken vows to and been buried upright to hold them. In the center, a well, not made of stone, but bone, pale, worn smooth and humming softly with that same lullaby rhythm. Milla walked to its edge, looked down, did not speak. The others joined her. Iseult looked first. What she saw was not water, not darkness, but her father's hands, rough, gentle, carving her name into a bit of driftwood the day before he drowned. Farah's reflection showed the miller's daughter, not dying in childbirth, but laughing in the river, throwing stones. Guy looked into the well and saw a man he had never become, gentler, slower, holding the hand of a girl who might have been a daughter. And Alinor. She saw herself as a child, digging with her bare hands in winter earth, burying a sparrow with care, whispering an apology no one had taught her to say. The blinking man was gone, but his shape remained in the garden, a bent tree at the edge of the clearing, its bark peeling in the pattern of a spiral. Milla stepped into the well. There was no splash, no drop. She simply descended, like smoke. And when she was gone, the song stopped. The others didn't speak. They didn't mourn. They sat one by one beside the well and waited. The sky above them flickered. Daylight folded into dusk and dusk into a warmth-like memory, that strange hour when time becomes soft, when stories are told slowly and no one asks if they are true. In time, the garden would disappear. In time, the names would fade. But the vow would remain etched not in stone, but in the habits of those who lived long after, the way they paused before speaking, the way they stepped gently around wildflowers, the way they sang to the earth when they thought no one was listening. Because what the earth remembers is not blood, not victory, not suffering. It remembers what was promised and what was kept.
The garden faded, not vanished, but gently withdrawn, like a tide pulling back from the shore, leaving only its scent behind. A hush settled over the land, not from absence, but from fullness. The kind of silence that comes after a story is told and everyone is still listening, afraid to move too soon. In that hush, the orchard appeared. They didn't walk to it. They were there. It rose from a low fog, each tree knotted and thick with bark, the color of old tea leaves. Some bore fruit, round, pale things like waxen moons. Others grew only leaves, long and thin and silver-veined, rustling without wind. There were no paths between them, no signs, just space and trees and the slow drift of memory. Alinor moved first. She did not know where she was going, only that she had been called. The orchard seemed to sense her, branches lowering slightly, leaves curling in faint deference. She passed under them like walking beneath the arms of old friends or ghosts with unfinished words. At the foot of one tree lay a bundle of cloth. She knelt and peeled it open with slow hands. Inside, a ribbon, once crimson,
now browned by weather and time. It had belonged to her sister, the one they'd buried too young, the one who'd asked, on her last day, if love meant remembering someone after. Eleanor stood. "I remember," she said aloud, though no one had asked. Behind her, Isolde moved through the trees. She passed a branch strung with feathers, bones, little tokens of no clear meaning, and yet her fingers trembled when she touched them. A ring of stone rested in the crook of one root, still warm. There was no Thera there, not truly, but in the orchard's far corner stood a tree with bark as pale as milk. Its trunk bore 7 notches, and at its base a comb, the kind carved from antler, the kind given between lovers who had no weddings. Isolde knelt and placed her palm against the tree. "I remember," she whispered. Guy walked the perimeter. He did not enter the orchard fully. He stopped before a tree with no fruit, no leaves, only bark that flaked like old paint. Carved into it was a name, his own, followed by another.
It began with the sound of soil shifting, not crumbling, shifting, as if the ground were exhaling, as if everything beneath their feet had merely been waiting, not dormant, but listening. When the light faded, the 3 found themselves lying on a slope of loam and moss, mouths dry, skin chilled as if they'd been dipped in night. But the orchard was gone. So was the figure at the gate. So was the garden. Floating, thick in the air like steam. Eleanor reached to touch it, and the droplet quivered. It wasn't a wound, it was a memory. A fight by a hearth, a door slammed too hard, a name she never spoke again. Isolde's breath caught. She reached to her own shoulder, where a faded scar lived, a mark from long ago, when she had run into a wall in the dark, chasing a scream that ended up being her own. The pain hadn't returned, but the weight had. The cage in the valley pulsed once, only once, as if greeting them, or warning. When they reached it, they circled it in silence. Its surface wasn't bone, not truly. Closer now, they saw it was woven, of sinew, a vine, of threads braided with hair. Some locks were red, some black, some gone gray with age. On the ground at the base of the structure were objects: a ribbon, a comb, a bit of driftwood carved with initials, a braid coiled in a silver ring, all from lives that no longer belonged to them. These weren't offerings, they were relinquishments. Eleanor laid her fingers on the ribbon. "We're not meant to carry it all," she whispered. "No," said Isolde, "but we're meant to know that we did." Guy didn't kneel. He didn't touch the wood. He only looked through the narrow slit in the cage. Inside was darkness, and inside that darkness was another spiral. Not drawn, not carved, it moved, like a slow whirlpool, turning endlessly inward. Not a trap, not a curse, just a truth. Everything returns. Eleanor stepped closer. Her breath fogged the air. In that breath, she saw a child's face. Milla. Still, serene, with a sprig of rosemary tucked behind her ear. "I kept it," Eleanor whispered. The spiral pulsed. She stepped back. The air shimmered, and the cage began to unravel. The threads loosened, rising like ash on a wind that hadn't been there before.
The objects at its base were lifted, not swept away, but lifted, as if taken by unseen hands, or perhaps returned to the earth. When the last strand disappeared, they were alone in the valley. No cage, no offerings, no spiral, just sky. Blue now, not green. The trees in the distance had become familiar, and in that moment they knew the vow was complete. Not because they had won, not because they had conquered, but because they had remembered, and they had chosen not to forget again.
They emerged from the valley with the sun at their backs. It was not a blazing sun, nothing sharp, nothing searing, only warmth, thin and soft as worn wool, spilling gently over the land, the kind of light that didn't chase away the dark, but simply kept it company. The path ahead was no longer hidden. It wound through bracken and low hills, where frost still clung to the grass and the trees bore no leaves, a trail not marked by signs, but by the hush of the world, the hush that comes after the weeping has passed, after the blood has dried, after the stories have ended, but before the silence has claimed them. They walked it slowly. Alinor, Yuselt, Guy. No more voices in the woods, no more spirals on stone, only the memory of those things and the heaviness of having survived. Alinor's boots were soaked through, her hands were cracked, but her eyes had steadied, the tremor in them, always waiting, always scanning the edges of the world for what might reach through, had quieted. Yuselt kept her hand on her satchel. Inside it only 3 things: a knife, a folded scrap of cloth, and a stone she had carried since childhood. The cloth had been a sleeve once. The knife had belonged to her mother. The stone she had picked up the day her village burned. She never meant to keep them forever, but she also never meant to lose them. Now, they weighed almost nothing. Guy walked with his head slightly bowed, but not from shame, not from weariness, from reverence. There had been no victory, no vanquishing, no catharsis, only understanding, and that was enough.
Side by side, not as pilgrims, not as witnesses, as rememberers. Alinor turned her face to the sky, cloudless, deep and dark and full of unspoken stars. She whispered a name, not aloud, but the wind carried it all the same. Iseult laid her stone beside the well. Guy placed his hand on her shoulder, and they waited. Not for answers, not for signs, only for the stillness, the deep stillness that means you have reached the end. You may rest now. And the land, at last, was silent. The spirals did not return. The trees did not whisper. The door beneath the earth remained closed. But the lanterns stayed lit, flickering gently, as if saying, we were here. As if saying, we left something behind so others might find their way. And beyond the glade, the path curved once more, into shadow, into story. But they did not follow, not this time, not tonight. They stayed together until morning and long after.